Hi, everyone, and welcome to Interviews with Foucauldians. And today I am here with Deere. And if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Yeah, so thank you, David. It's great to be here. So I'm Deere. I'm an adjunct professor at Fordham University in the Department of Philosophy.
And can you tell me what your areas of specialization are?
So I work on social and political philosophy broadly construed, especially Latin American philosophy and decolonial theory, as well as Foucault and 20th century French thought.
Great. And so you have written quite a bit about Michel Foucault, and in particular using his writings from primarily the 1970s to think about the nature and the construction of space and spatiality. And so this is where I would like to begin our conversation today, if that's okay with you. And in particular, you wrote a piece, let me see, it was last year in the Inter-American Journal of Philosophy, entitled, and I'm just looking at the title here that I have in front of me, Coloniality and Disciplinary Power on Spatial Techniques of Ordering. And in it, you make the argument that the European colonial project that really gets started in the early 1500s expressed itself first and foremost as a European desire to test a new spatiality in the colonies and to introduce a very specific kind of spatial order. And so can you talk to me about what this is and what the connection is to the colonial project?
Yeah, so, I mean, I read Foucault as a very spatial thinker. I think space is something that's there in a lot of his works, even in the early stuff in the work on archaeology. Space is a kind of concept that's important for him to think the way in which discourse is organized. And so it's much more central, you could say, in the middle work when you see the way in which power gets organized. Power is spatialized. So the prison, the hospital, the factory, the military camp, these are all spatial institutions. And through organizing a space, they begin to construct a new technique of power. Now, what I was interested in this work, and still really am quite interested in now, is the way in which power operates in the Americas and the way in which space gets organized in the Americas. So I'm particularly interested in the way in which we can think about 1492 and its aftermath as a kind of not just a historical event, but a philosophical event, or an event that has great philosophical import for us to think about. And one way in which the conquest of the Americas and the encounter of the Americas shapes out is really a spatial encounter. It's a space that didn't have a place in the European mindset. So there will be a kind of question of how to conceptualize that space, but then also how to organize and order that space that Europe poses as they embark on this colonial project. So that's kind of where the project started, I guess, in that turn to coloniality, colonialism, and space.
Great. And you mentioned in your work that there is a way in which we can think about the spatial ordering that happens with the advent of the Europeans on this side of the Atlantic. Although I should say that side of the Atlantic, since I'm currently in Europe, I'm in the center rather than the periphery myself. But you mentioned that there is this construal of the Americas and the colonies as a site of non-being. But over time, Europe starts relating to this non-being of the space of the Americas, almost as a laboratory where they can test out new, more concrete forms of spatial ordering that go just beyond thinking about everything outside of Europe as a sort of abyss. And one of the things that you talk quite explicitly about is the 1512 Laws of Burgos, which really introduced a series of principles for the organization of space in the Americas. And so I want to hear a little bit more about this, because here's where we get some of the more concrete illustrations of how space was really created through this colonial gesture, this colonial act of overreach.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really helpful question. And exactly, like, I think we see both this technique of an abyss. There is a kind of what I would call abyssal reason in the colonial approach to the Americas, seeing it as completely empty, seeing it as free for appropriation. And so it's important to account for that, and there's been really good work accounting for that. But then there's this production of order that's happening that's not just abyssal. It's, as you say, there's a kind of, the Americas are treated as a laboratory for these new spatial techniques and for new methods of ordering. So the laws of Burgos are really interesting, and a lot of 16th century Spanish thinking is very interesting in this respect. Both the laws that are written, the history of cartography, and a number of different kind of spatial projects are very interesting in this period. But one thing I look at in the laws of Burgos specifically is how daily life is structured, and how the experience of both European and indigenous life is being structured in the Americas according to a kind of spatial regime of ordering that's trying to regularize the behavior of, I mean, for the indigenous, they're trying to create a regularized behavior that would, on the one hand, be oriented towards a kind of productive labor, and on the other hand, one that would be organized towards evangelization and towards a kind of a disciplined subjectivity spiritually.
And I want to return to this question of the production of labor and the production of faith. But for our viewers who may not be familiar with the laws of Burgos, can you give us some illustrations, some concrete examples of what the laws indicated about how space was supposed to be constructed and organized very much on the ground, just to give it some life?
Yeah, so one thing that we see is the idea that space should be organized as a kind of grid. And that the order to the city should be given in advance. And so that we should have, in the center, we should have the kind of central institutions of the colonial city. So we should have a church, we should have the town hall, we should have other municipal functions. And then we should have, kind of radiating out from the center, we should have this grid. And we should have things organized in such a way that the waste of the city is downwind and the hospital is placed in a strategic location. And so they're thinking about all these things in a very specific way in the 16th century. And if you read, I mean, as a Foucauldian or as someone who reads Foucault closely, when you read this text, it's very reminiscent of some of the writings that Foucault has on disciplinary power, where he's talking about the organization of a space in terms of regulating what bodies can do within that space. So I guess one of the ways in which I read this document is a kind of, I talk about it in terms of organizing the walls of the city without actually necessarily needing walls. Now, a lot of colonial cities on the islands in the Caribbean, you will see, colonial forts, heavy walls. But a lot of the principle of the construction of the city was less about constructing heavy walls and defense in the sense, and more, I think, about constructing a kind of productive order within the city itself.
Well, and one of the things that I find really interesting and very helpful about your writing on this subject is that you contrast the dream of this objective Newtonian grid that's supposed to flourish in the colonies to the relatively ungeometric structure of the medieval city, right? So at the time in Europe, you do not find this grid. And you use the Foucauldian concept of a heterotopia as this place outside where a new kind of order can be produced, tested, and implemented. And it seems to me as if this really speaks to a very fundamental desire of the colonizing subject, this idea that by creating space, a geometric space in the colonies, they are able to produce an order that they don't actually see around them. Again, because you don't really find this anywhere in Europe. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this, about what this desire to geometrize, I will use that as a verb, it's okay, or to render space geometrical, tells us about the impulse behind coloniality itself.
Yeah, I think that's super important, is it's this kind of compensatory function that it has to order space that's not ordered within Europe, and to, I think this is important for me in thinking about how something new is being produced in the colonial project, and it's not something that's just coming from Europe, let's say, and being imposed onto America. It's actually something that is a transformative moment. And so the heterotopia is very useful for thinking about how new spaces, new techniques of power, new modes of epistemology emerge in other spaces. And I mean, the heterotopia oftentimes gets read and thought about as a kind of emancipatory, or as a kind of opening against spaces of domination. But one thing that we see in this case is the formation of new techniques of domination that are taking place through the colonial project. So I think there is this kind of real impulse to order that you see in this colonial project. And I was really influenced by the idea of Angel Rama, who's a Uruguayan literary theorist who writes about what he calls the lettered city. And he writes, the first short chapter is about the concept of order in the colonies. And so that idea really struck me, that we should be thinking about colonialism not only as an imposition, but as actually something that's producing new techniques of power. So I think that the
Mhm.
the heterotopia points us in that direction.
Yeah, and the productivity here goes beyond just a new technique of ordering space, and it goes all the way to the production of new forms of subjectivity amongst Amerindians. And this is where your discussion of faith that I said I wanted to return to, I think is quite important, because it seems as if one of the functions that space is meant to play, or that the ordering of space into a grid is meant to play in starting in 1492 and thereafter, is that it's really supposed to instill a Christianity among the local population. And you make the argument that when the colonizers arrived, they faced what they saw was this problem of the essential inherent forgetfulness of the Amerindians, which is that, you would teach them, I don't know, some lesson from catechism, you would teach them about the commandments, etc. And they seem to, from the standpoint of the colonizing force, to just forget about it. And so I want to hear more from you about this relationship between space, faith, and then this perception of the forgetfulness of the indigenous populations.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's something about this construction of space in the Americas that's it's very utopian. I would call it a heterotopia, more properly speaking, but there's a utopian project there as well. That there's this hope for the European colonizers that they can produce a kind of perfect city of faith and produce a kind of reconciling of humanity in this way. I mean, not always, I don't think it's always actually so benevolent as it oftentimes sounds, but faith was a really central aspect of the colonial project. And like you said, it gets referred to as an inconstancy of the Amerindian soul, that they're prone to wandering. They don't I think it's a really interesting form of resistance that we see here, because it doesn't get formulated as a kind of active resistance necessarily, or a strong refusal to listen to the evangelization. Instead, it's kind of like, okay, yeah, listen to the catechism, maybe even repeat it. And then what seems to bother particularly a lot of the Jesuits who were there in Paraguay and in Brazil and other places, is that they'll just wander away and shake off this faith and like as if nothing had happened. They don't take it seriously. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, that discussion for me is one that could be expanded quite a bit. I haven't done a great deal of work to go even further, but I think the production of subjectivity has so much to do with this question of the production of religious subjectivity, which is something that Foucault was interested in, but in a very different context. But he does really turn to questions of confession and questions of religious practices of the self very centrally. So that's a project I'm interested to go deeper into at some point, but I haven't quite fitted into my agenda just yet. So yeah.
Well, and even in Discipline and Punish, for example, when he's talking about the rise of disciplinary power in the 18th and 19th centuries, Foucault will say that the function of the prison, with its focus on managing the most recondite corners of our comportment, those minute details of our behavior in the prison, he says it's to produce a soul. It is to create a specific kind of identity where you come to see yourself in a fundamentally new way. And even your reference to the incontinence of the Amerindians, Foucault writes about this in volume 2 of the history of sexuality in connection to the Greeks. But nonetheless, there is this continuity here about the connection between the space one inhabits and the kind of subjectivity that can take root in that space. And it seems like for the Europeans, the ordering, and I think this comes out of your work, the ordering of space is a precondition for the ordering of the soul of the Amerindians. Or maybe even a precondition for them to have a soul, since that was also a debate of its own, right? Whether the Amerindians even had a soul that could be saved in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a great reference in Discipline and Punish, to think about what disciplinary power is doing as this sculpting of subjectivity. So why is space so important? It's not just this abstract desire for a grid. It's setting up the conditions of possibility for a new kind of social and political order, and for the subjectivity that will inhabit that social political order.
Yeah, and one of the examples that really stuck with me from your writing is that, and again, thinking about this in the most concrete ways, that one of the laws of Burgos, for example, or I forget if it was the 1573 ordinances or the royal decree, but just the rule that when constructing a new city in the Americas, you shouldn't be able to wander away from the city center so much that you lose the church from view. And so once you get far away from, far enough that you no longer see the church, the rule said you need to construct a new church so that you never are anywhere in the colony without having a church in your perceptual field. So again, how this construction of space, this regulation of space, has an internal function, again, in terms of what you're calling the sculpting of the Amerindian into a sort of like brown European.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of a fear of the abyss. There's a fear of the emptiness of space that can consume you on the frontier, in the colony. And so the construction of space is producing a kind of a security for the constitution of subjectivity. I mean, you see this in a very different way in the Puritans in North America. Their interaction with Native Americans is very different than the Spanish project of evangelization. But they're concerned in their own way for their own Puritan community to create this, they describe it as a hedge in the wilderness. And that's very much about that. Let me just go to the regular mic.
Okay. I mean, they're very much interested in creating this hedge in the wilderness, this kind of sanctuary, and for them, it's about protecting themselves from these external forces of the wilderness. The Spanish colonial project is much more interested in evangelizing the indigenous Americans and creating this space that, yeah, like you say, will Europeanize and Christianize the indigenous people in the Americas. So
yeah, and this account, about the construction of space, of course, begins in the early 1500s. I mean, it really does begin as early as 1492. But then you make the argument that it actually continues, and we can see the downstream effects all the way down, at least into the 19th century. And you talk, for example, about the Pampas in Argentina, and the way in which well into the 19th century, there is this fear about what a space like the Pampas, which are just very expansive, and they, they blur the line between the land and the sky. There's no horizon. They just seem to stretch for all infinity, and they are reflective of the sunlight, etc. And how this space is seen as also producing a kind of subjectivity in the native populations that in some way resists the project of Europe. I want to hear a little bit more about that, because it got me thinking about the ways in which the materiality of the territory, I'm here just thinking literally the land, the geography, can by itself sometimes upend this heterotopic project of turning space into a perfect grid. Like sort of the land gets in the way sometimes.
Yeah, I like that formulation, actually. I think that's really interesting to think of how the land can have its own kind of resistance to this project of ordering. And in the case of Argentina and the Pampas, I think there's this idea that land is just this huge expanse, and that it's creating a kind of moral degeneracy because people don't live in a city, and a city is a space of civilization. So you see this kind of connection in the post kind of independence period in Latin America, of the need to continue to spread civilization, which is thought of as something that has to take place in the city. And this question of, well, how do you do that? How do you integrate a nation state without making the entire nation state a grid? So there is a kind of natural resistance to that. One other thing I was going to say on that issue is, I think just this idea of a kind of moral geography, which is one that you see early on in the stuff we've been talking about in the 16th century, but you see it in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, in terms of thinking about race and racism and racialization of populations, through a notion of a kind of a moral geography, that certain geographies produce the wrong moral dispositions, right? And certain
that's right.
humans. Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting work there to think about how space continues to be such an organizing principle of the post-colonial world, or the post-independence world. And a lot of these problems of ordering continue to pervade Latin America. And I think we could think about it in the United States, it would be slightly different, but there will be similar questions to raise, vis-a-vis the frontier and homesteading, kind of questions.
It seems almost as if the subject, or the soul, or the psyche is this liquid that will take the shape of whatever physical containment or container it finds itself in. Because I remember growing up in Mexico, hearing about, people from the coasts, they have a very different moral orientation because they are from the coast. So they are lazy and they are slow. similar moralization of the jungle, a different moralization of the desert. And here, specifically with the example of the Pampas, it's as if, because the Pampas are so vast and so delimited, they create this subjectivity that just sort of like spills out and cannot be contained, just like the Pampas themselves. And I like the notion that even in the Pampas, which, I mean, if there's going to be a place that is conducive to the grid, you would assume that it's the Pampas, right? Because of that expanse, that openness. But even there, you see like this relationship between the territory and the soul is much more, it sort of goes beyond what the dream of the grid can authorize.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think I want to be careful not to naturalize the geography too much, or to use that in a kind of a careful way, because you see how it's used as a moral geography to racialize subjects, to exclude them, to hierarchize. But I think that what you're pointing to is really interesting, that it's also a source of resistance, and it's a source of it can be a source to organize the soul in another manner, and to resist the capture of power through different kinds of modes of spatialization of one's life. And just on the other point that you're talking about, how you would think that the Pampas would be a place that would be ripe for the grid to be spread, I think that's really interesting. Also, because a lot of what you see in terms of like a global spatial reasoning that's taking place is, map making in a new way, a kind of new geometrization of the globe. And you see like, the space of the sea is now a space that is being conceptualized in terms of a grid, and a space that the European colonizer are trying to kind of lock down in a way, even though it's kind of the ultimate space that cannot be gridded, right? It's a space that's, there's no anchor to this.
That's right, yes.
But it becomes a model almost for trying to organize even the most, I guess, chaotic of spaces. Mm-hmm. But I think it is interesting to think about how there's a certain resistance to that, even a non-subjective one that comes from a geography or a landscape. And I haven't thematized that as much in my work, but I'm interested by that question, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, this theme of resistance brings us to the second topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is that, much of your work does bear the traces of Foucault's influences, but you're also working in connection with the Argentinian-Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel. And he's mostly known for his work in what is known in connection to his own work as philosophy of liberation or liberation philosophy. And so for our listeners who have maybe never heard this term, can you just say a few things about what liberation philosophy is, and how it might relate to or differ from the more common term that maybe some people have heard of, which is liberation theology, which has been a major player in Latin American politics over the course of the 20th century. And so what is liberation philosophy?
So liberation philosophy emerges at a similar time to liberation theology, and a number of, I would say, both theoretical and praxis-oriented shifts taking place in Latin America in the 60s and 70s. So I think in order to think about what liberation philosophy is, it's important to think about kind of other things that are happening in Latin America. So one thing is liberation theology essentially tries to turn around the vision of the mission of the church, or tries to restore the vision of the mission of the Catholic Church as one that's supposed to give a preferential option for the poor, and especially for the historically, colonized. So Latin America should be a privileged space for, there should be a preferential option for the poor of Latin America in the mission of the Catholic Church. At the same time, you have, events like the Cuban Revolution. You have a kind of a renewed interest in what the meaning of freedom is in Latin America, and I think in the global South more generally. You have the Algerian Revolution taking place as well. So there's a kind of, I think, a renewed interest in freedom, and a renewed interest in what freedom would mean for countries in Latin America and for the people of Latin America. And largely it has to do with a kind of a realization that the independence project in the 19th century has failed to fully emancipate the people of Latin America. And so liberation philosophy kind of has that jumping off point, and it has I guess also the last background point I would add there is a kind of a newfound realization of the nature of imperialism, and what we would now call something like coloniality, the persistence of colonial structures of power and imperial structures of power that are creating systemic underdevelopment in Latin America. So this realization that underdevelopment is not a product of some kind of internal failure or some kind of mentality that's internal to Latin American people, but it's actually something that's part of a global system. So liberation philosophy is kind of operating in this with these sets of concepts and these sets of breakthroughs going on. But most of those things that I've mentioned are either in the domain of sociology, or in the domain of politics, or in the domain of theology. So the question is, what does philosophy have to do with all of these transformations? I think one is a realization that colonialism and imperialism are also epistemological problems. The realization that there has been a colonization of the mind. And so that colonization of the mind, the fight against the colonization of the mind, is going to go together with the struggle for a new sense of freedom. So that's I think kind of where liberation philosophy takes off. And Enrique Dussel is one figure among a larger movement. He's kind of become the most well-known figure of that era, and he's one of the ones that's still quite active. But he's not the only thinker that's involved in what we would call liberation philosophy. And so
if we focus on his work, because he is, as you point out, one of the more active ones, especially in an English-speaking context, and his work has been translated and is starting to get a lot of attention in Europe and North America over the past 15 to 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. There is this, I think, your claim about the realization that the colonization, that coloniality extends to the mind. I think that's a really good way of putting what is at stake and why questions of epistemology and metaphysics and ethics and aesthetics, which we associate with branches of philosophy, then get brought up in this context. And the way in which Dussel launches this criticism of the colonial project is through a criticism of Cartesian modernity, right? That Europe has told a specific narrative about the meaning of modernity in the 16th, really 17th century, but that this is already a colonial narrative. It is a colonial myth that is only possible because there is this other modernity that appears only when you look at this historical period from the standpoint, not of the colonizer, but of the colonized. And so can you talk a little bit about this epistemological dimension of colonialism, and in particular, the role that Descartes plays in it, because he seems to be the core focus of tension in the way in which at least Enrique Dussel presents his criticism.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Descartes is an interesting figure to focus on. He doesn't, is not someone who really writes a political philosophy. He's not someone, like John Locke, who actually has a stake in the colonial project, or, someone like Kant, who wrote about race. But he's the one who's, early on considered to be the kind of, founder of modern philosophy. And the founder of the modern subject, which is, it's an epistemological problem, right? Descartes' subject is a subject of epistemology, a subject of self-certainty, of absolute self-certainty. And this is actually where some of the interest in space comes back in Dussel as well, is there's a kind of critique that the self-certainty of the Cartesian subject is a self-certainty that takes place from nowhere. It's a self-certainty that's not rooted, it's not rooted even in a body, right? Descartes' not even certain of his own body. So this self-certainty is one that takes place from nowhere, and seemingly, we would say, a neutral subject. Dussel's critique is that the ego cogito is in fact only something that comes after a prior history of the ego conquero. The I conquer comes before the I think. And so he wants to establish that there's a kind of parallel between these two modes of subjectivity, and there's really a prehistory to the ego cogito, which makes possible this kind of absolute self-certainty. And so, according to Dussel, it's a kind of the absolute self-certainty that the colonizer has over the people in the colonies as the other, as the others, that they constitute their own subjectivity as absolute against these others who they constitute as a kind of nothingness. And this, for Dussel, kind of parallels the disembodied nature of Descartes' thought, and also a kind of absolute, dislocated mode of thinking.
And just the fundamental inability of somebody like Descartes to recognize the geopolitical forces that would even make something like the Cartesian project thinkable in the first place. This desire for absolute self-imposed foundations. It's like that clearly seems like something that somebody going through a process of colonization wouldn't even begin to think about, because this idea that you can found yourself is already sort of foreclosed when you find yourself, facing this onslaught from without. So there's this negation of just where you are and when you are.
Yeah. And I think it's also this abstract spatialization. I mean, Descartes' also a geometer, so it's interesting to think of this kind of geometric space in which the subject is constructed. I think Dussel is making a convincing case that this has something to do with the colonial project and the construction of the self in this way is made possible by European colonialism. And it now occludes the location from which this kind of thought is supposed to be coming. So it gives us a kind of a supposed neutrality, supposed universality, because it's supposed to be without any space, without any locality. But that's kind of precisely what makes it so dangerous, is this disavowed foundation.
Which mirrors the attitude of Europe, post 1492, the idea that Europe is this both center and, this centerpiece, the center of the world that is unconditioned by what is outside it, but that nonetheless conditions that which is outside it. So it's a unidirectional understanding, which again mirrors just the exercise of doubt in Descartes, where everything emanates outward from this disembodied subject that is at the center of philosophy.
That's exactly right. It has this spatialization as well, right? The center and the periphery, and this absolutely self-certain center. And that I like that way that you're talking about it, how it emanates outwards. And Descartes has to build his entire system from his own mind, right? From his absolute foundation, and build it outwards from there. And as if there's nothing that's taking place in the colonies.
Yeah, and one of the questions then that seems to ground a lot of work in the philosophy of the Americas, although this is a question that that also applies in Africana thought, in various strands of decolonial and post-colonial theory, is this question about the relevance of place for one's thinking. And in one of your articles, you put it really well, citing the work of José Martí, and the question that you pose, and it's the question that I want to pose to you now. And I just want to get it right, so I'm going to look at my notes. I'm going to cheat. And the question is this: what does it mean then to think from America rather than from Europe? Which is, again, the fundamental question, that where you are shapes how you think and what you think. And so now the question that I want to ask you is, if we enact a shift in our ways of thinking, in our philosophizing, in our epistemology, away from this European center that for such a long time has been left unquestioned, and we start philosophizing from the Americas, then what does that look like? Especially for those of us that, due to the nature of academic philosophy, have only been reared in European philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really great and very difficult question to answer. I mean, I think José Martí is a great example because he's trying to think, I mean, that comes from his famous essay, Nuestra América, Our America, and he's trying to think about concepts that would be adequate to his own reality in America. And he's trying to think about kind of political concepts that would be adequate to that reality. I think, it goes into, for him, it goes into a deep kind of ancestral, let's shift where we see the source of thought. Let's shift I guess, the very canon of thought. So for him, he says, we have our own Greeks, we have the ancestral traditions of indigenous Americans, and let's see what kinds of resources are there. I think, there's difficulties and there's problems with romanticizing that possibility. But I think what Martí points us to is the possibility of shifting the fundamental reference of one's thinking. So both the theoretical set of resources that you're drawing from, but then also the kind of, I guess, the refusal to account for one's own spatiality, one's own spatialization. Mm-hmm. I think what Martí is doing is also an internal critique for him of Latin American intellectuals who have wanted to borrow ideas from Europe. And I think that a lot of what decolonial philosophy and philosophy of liberation is trying to think about today is how to think through those legacies of the colonization of thought, and also how to think through, well, okay, Latin American thought is in many ways by its very nature kind of hybrid. It can't fully exclude the European history that goes into the construction of Latin America, but you can think about the specificity of Latin American space, or a specific space within Latin America's Cuban space or Puerto Rican space, the space of the Caribbean as a question is one by a non-Latin American thinker, by Francophone thinker like Edouard Glissant. You get a beautiful and incredibly original thinking about, I think, what it means to think from one's space and from one's place. But for Glissant, it's a kind of history of uprooting that he's thinking through.
Yeah, and that has to do specifically with the Afro-Caribbean context to which he's speaking, and the Francophone as well. And with Martí, we have a sort of attunement to different conditions on the ground. But I mean, this really raises some very interesting questions, not just philosophical, but also personal for me, although the two need not be different. Because it is right that, for example, when I think about something like Mexican identity, just to use an example that is close to home, there is this sense that Mexican identity is this byproduct of what was there before the Europeans arrived, the Spanish arrived, and the Spanish themselves, who inserted themselves into this history and are now part of it, for better or worse. Certainly for worse in many ways, but it's not as if we can go back and recover some pristine origin that was there. And so I like that you flagged this risk of a potential romanticization. Although even that, I think the risk is overblown, especially in comparison to what we know are the real dangers of the romanticization of Europe and its European origins. Yeah, but the second question that it raises, and I think this certainly goes beyond that personal reference, is how the periphery, and I'm here going to use the terms that Dussel uses, periphery and center, of how the periphery should relate to the center. Now, Dussel himself, and you've written about this, he sort of doubles down on the possibility of a rational discourse between the periphery and the center, primarily through the form of a demand for justice, where the periphery can speak to the center using the language of the center. And you you raise a series of concerns about this move, which for you seems to turn on this desire to save the reason of modernity. And so my question is about that. So if we're not going to enter into a rational dialogue with the center, it seems that the other possibility seems to be to enter into relations of violence with the center. And you turn to another Francophone thinker, Frantz Fanon, for thinking about this. So can you say just a few words about this? Because I think this goes to a really core issue in terms of, I mean, really center margin relations.
Yeah, it's a huge question. And I think, I mean, Dussel does an amazing job of tracing out this legacy of modernity and showing that modernity itself is not a isolated European phenomenon, but that European modernity is as an isolated thing is kind of a myth, that actually what we have is a global modernity. And so out of that idea of a kind of global modernity, Dussel seeks to kind of rescue the reason of modernity and the emancipatory possibility of that reason that's been lost in the name of instrumental reason, instrumental violence that's largely been part of that history of modernity. My argument is to say that perhaps we can't separate instrumental reason and emancipatory reason so neatly or so easily, and that there's a kind of entanglement between the violent legacy of modernity and the emancipatory legacy of modernity. I guess what I'm concerned in Dussel is whether or not we too quickly resuscitate the value of a certain kind of reason, and whether that kind of gives in too much in terms of what the periphery has to do to meet the center, and to enter into dialogue with the center. So I use, in that article that you're talking about, I use Fanon to think a little bit about how perhaps new kinds of discourse can come through onto the playing field through different kinds of shifts. And of course, Fanon points you towards questions of violence. And I think it's a really difficult question to disentangle this emancipatory possibility of reason from the question of violence. In a way, I'm in that article still kind of sidestepping the question to think about other modes of discourse that might not get counted as reason, and how those might kind of push us to account for new possibilities. So questions like the aesthetic, questions like, I guess, other modes of writing and thinking that don't get counted as philosophy, that don't get counted as cosmology, that don't get counted in a variety of ways. Perhaps there's ways in thinking about them that doesn't abandon entirely the project or the possibility of what reason might mean, but doesn't immediately enter into a kind of center periphery dialogue. So I think thinking about that global sense of modernity in a very polyvalent way is really helpful rather than thinking about it as a kind of a binary center periphery dialogue that has to take place. I do think those center periphery dialogues are valuable, and there is potential there as well. Yeah. But I worry if that's the first place that we go after excavating this kind of history that Dussel is writing about.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right that this rush to the center, right, it might have a function, but there's always a question of priority, whether that's where our focus should be. And I like the way you've presented this in terms of thinking about everything that, from the perspective of the center, will not count as dialogue. So everything that the center excludes as non-rational, whether that's myth, whether that's religion, whether that's spirituality, whether that's forms of violence in the name of liberation, but also forms of traditional dialogue that the center will not count as dialogue because they don't involve the center. So sort of horizontal, periphery to periphery. You know, I mean, if I'm getting my mathematical metaphors, like a tangent that only goes through the circumference and doesn't ever care for the center. You know, from the standpoint of the center, that's not a meaningful speech act.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's the decentering of the geography of reason, and seeing, you know, something like comparative philosophy is always thought of as kind of East and West, or maybe it's then thought of as other peripheries and the West. But what kinds of dialogues are possible between peripheries, between different geographies of the global South? I think that those can raise new discourses.
Yeah, and you do this, for instance, when you bring José Martí and Frantz Fanon together without necessarily having to go to the metropolis, you know, as it were. Now, we're running out of time, and so I just have one last question for you, and that is about your current and future work. What's on the back burner? What are the questions that you're thinking about moving forward that you want to explore? Just a teaser.
Yeah, so I mean, these questions on coloniality and space have been percolating for a long time, and I'm actually working now in finishing, or at least getting towards the final stages of a book manuscript that will bring together some of these issues, both the work on coloniality and disciplinary power in the construction of space that we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, but also bringing together some of the way that I read Enrique Dussel's work, especially as a kind of a spatial thinker. And I'm interested to think about how coloniality as a kind of global account of power, or the coloniality of power, intersects with these accounts that are more kind of Foucauldian in nature, that look at the local construction of space and power. So that project is one that's been with me for a while, and I'm hoping to get the book manuscript out in the next year.
Okay, congratulations on that.
Thank you. And then I've been doing work recently on another figure who's important in the book project for me, is Santiago Castro Gomez, who's a Colombian philosopher, and I've just completed a translation of his book called 0 Point Hubris, which is a kind of Foucauldian reading of coloniality in New Granada, which was a space that included many kind of Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador in the late colonial period prior to independence. So I've just finished translating that, and I think the next kind of thing that I'm going to write is just an article about Castro Gomez and thinking about his thought more directly. So I'm kind of working on something in that direction as well. and he's, I mean, for the topic of Foucault, he's a very interesting thinker that brings together issues of Foucault and Latin America and histories of colonialism and coloniality.
Great. Well, with that, I think we are out of time. And Dawn, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat with me. And just by way of summary, so far we talked quite a bit about your work on Foucault and spatiality in relation to colonialism. And we talked about the moralization of geography that occurs within this context. And we also talked to some degree about what is called liberation philosophy, which is, we could say, the philosophical version of liberation theology, although with some differences. One of the figures that has been associated with this movement is Enrique Dussel, who is somebody that you work on. And I look forward to seeing your book when it's out on print. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time.
Thank you so much for the conversation, David. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you.